Well, it's a great pleasure, Phil, to have you here. Unfortunately, this probably won't be at the level of your interview with our friend Lilia Smailovic, but I think it's interesting, given that we're commemorating 30 years of many important things in Yugoslavia, 25 years also since the 5th of October. So big year here. Yeah. And I think you have been sort of crucial in exposing to the world sort of how Serbia and the Serbs were perceived in the West during the 90s and 2000s. So I think it might be good to kind of like revisit those bad old times with you. And recently I came across the tome you edited with Edward S. Herman of manufacturing consent thing. He wrote it with Chomsky,
yes, yeah.
Which is probably one of the most comprehensive analyses of the media coverage across the world of the NATO bombing. So first, I mean, given that I like to get into the nitty-gritty of things, I mean, how was preparing that tome? Because it had many great authors. I mean, Harold Pinter wrote the foreword, I think.
Yes. Well, it all came about, to be honest, it came about slightly by accident. I had been intending to write a book about media coverage of the breakup of Yugoslavia before the Kosovo War happened, and so I was kind of already interested in that and thinking about that. But I viewed that as quite a kind of long-term project, and then the Kosovo War happened. I was very upset and annoyed by the media coverage, and I wrote a couple of things in the newspapers, short opinion pieces in the newspapers in London, one for the Independent and one for the Times. And an editor at Pluto Press, saw those and emailed me and said, "That was good, why don't you write a book?" And I said, "Oh yeah, well, that's going to take a while." No, she said, no, I mean a fast book. so the only way to do it fast, I thought, was to do it as an edited collection. And as it happened, other people had also got in touch with me, including Ed Herman, and also Diana Johnstone had got in touch, on the basis of those newspaper articles. So I thought, okay, why don't we try and do a quick, responsive, edited book?
Yeah, and I'm curious. I mean, because I was in Serbia back then, and so that's sort of what I knew. But what was the sort of status of people who kind of tried to analyze what was going on as things were going on? I mean, obviously it was a war, it was a humanitarian crisis. It's incredible that your voice could be heard in the Independent and the Times, I think.
Yes, well, I have to say the media, all the newspapers apart from one, I think the Independent on Sunday was the exception. All the other newspapers were, of course, in favour of the NATO bombing, much as one would expect. But the media do like discussing themselves. And my kind of thing was about the media, so they kind of quite liked, I think, that angle where they could, have a bit of internal, as it were, internal discussion. And in fact, I think some journalists, at least, were aware that all was not right, that there was something a bit off in the fact that this, NATO was effectively waging a propaganda war, and couldn't do much about it, but nevertheless were kind of unhappy with it, and so it was a kind of opportunity also for them to.
Yeah. And you say NATO was waging propaganda war.
Yes.
So, in a sense, was it because obviously we're all hearing about the editorial independence of the BBC and all the various outlets around the world, whether especially private ones.
Mm-hmm.
How is that even possible? I mean, is there really no? Are there really governmental levers in all these?
Well, that's a big question. You mentioned manufacturing consent. The Herman and Chomsky propaganda model which aims to explain exactly that. Like, how does a kind of free market system end up producing propaganda comparable to, and they were writing this in the 1980s, comparable to the kind of Soviet state-controlled media. They deliberately drew that kind of parallel. And they have various answers to that. One is to do with ownership and advertising. Probably the most important ones in wartime, in moments of crisis, are firstly the reliance on official sources, and secondly the fact that those official sources, where the media fail to snap into line, will criticise them. Flak is the way that they put it. The journalists are subject to flak. So, in Britain that meant somebody like Alistair Campbell, who was the spin doctor for Tony Blair at the time.
Now also a podcaster.
Yeah, also a podcaster. Yes, incredible though that may seem. Yeah. So where journalists, and they were very, very nervous about it. They were conscious of the fact that they might not win the propaganda war, and they were doing their very best to kind of make sure that journalists followed the script. And then they were staging press conferences every day at the Ministry of Defence, at the Foreign Office, at NATO headquarters, also in Washington, of course. So there's like constant feed of information to the media that they want them to reproduce, and then strong criticism if they ever fail to reproduce it as desired. So I think it works. It works not in a kind of. I think people find it hard to understand how it can work so well when there isn't a kind of direct control. I think it is largely informal. But nevertheless, there are those kind of mechanisms there. And the other factor, which it was also kind of accounted for by Chomsky and Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model, is the fact that there was a large degree of agreement. That I said a moment ago that some journalists weren't happy with the way the media coverage was going, but a lot of them were. I would say the majority were. And they kind of were following a script that some of them had already helped to write in the 90s in Bosnia, So, this was kind of, they sort of knew, or they thought they knew, how to interpret events. They knew who the good guys were, NATO. They knew who the bad guys were, Serbia. So, it was kind of all almost too straightforward for them to just reproduce it all again.
And one of the, I think, most interesting documentaries that I've ever seen about the war was actually done and it was about the Bosnian War, by the Japanese state television, NHK. I think it's literally called Ethnic Cleansing, The Origins of the Terror. I'm not sure if you've ever seen it. And it actually follows these guys who work at Ruder Finn, which is a big PR firm. And sort of how, they were very open about how they were sort of crafting the narratives, crafting the photos, kind of publishing all of that. Was there, because I think there's a lot of this idea of these like nefarious spin masters really, working in the scenes. Was that the same thing in the UK or?
Yes, I think there was. Again, I think it's, you can look for kind of people working behind the scenes like PR agencies hired by the Bosnian government. And it's true, of course they were, and they had an influence. But it's not as if they single-handedly, people like Ruder Finn didn't single-handedly come up with the narrative and persuade the journalists to go along with it. Journalists had already, in the early 90s, already kind of were predisposed to want that narrative, as it were. The Bosnian War was already framed in those terms, even before it started, because of what had happened already in relation to Croatia and Slovenia, where it was very clear the attitude of powerful Western actors, and by and large journalists took their cue from them. And so you didn't, Ruder Finn were kind of pushing at an open door in that sense. They were kind of reinforcing a narrative that was already quite well established. So I think journalists, that reliance on and subservience to official sources is probably the key factor, rather than something that a PR firm might add.
And obviously the big part of the media push, or the propaganda push, was obviously humanitarianism.
Yes.
And I mean, I think there was also this piece of news about thousands of Kosovo Albanian men in this stadium in Pristina that are just about to be murdered by the Serbian forces, which was completely unsubstantiated, and later it was obviously retracted. But I mean, do you think it's this sort of like super humanitarian view of the war and I mean kind of global politics? Do you think it's I mean, it's been with us forever, right? And do you think there should be any sort of new ways that they have sort of pushed these buttons through the centuries? Do you think it's just like a constant?
I don't think it's a constant, no. I think that it was a relatively new departure, in fact, in the 90s. That was at the end of the decade when Tony Blair kind of spelled it out in his famous Chicago speech, The Doctrine of International Community. That was kind of articulating what had by that point become the kind of basically received wisdom about the way that international affairs should work, which was that you'd have a kind of cosmopolitan global order in which the role of the nation state was much diminished, and nation states would be subservient to international or transnational institutions such as NATO, in fact, or indeed the European Union, and the powerful countries of the world, and Blair obviously wanted to include Britain very much in that, but mostly one would think of the United States. The powerful would effectively police that. And his Chicago speech in 1999, while the bombing was going on, was all about like how do we decide when to intervene and when not, and that was the debate. The debate was not should we, but just when should we, when it would be most appropriate, and that was all justified on grounds of humanitarianism and human rights, on the assumption that those were kind of higher standards than any national law. It's a kind of profoundly not just anti-sovereigntist, but also anti-democratic view, because there's no democratic accountability for those transnational institutions. It's in fact if there's democratic accountability in the nation state, that's neither here nor there.
And it's always obviously moral urgency that pushes you to intervene, and obviously you don't have time to have referenda or whatever.
No, absolutely yes. There's always a pressing urgency.
Yeah. But I was saying that I think it was sort of a constant because, for example, during the Great War, the UK famously kind of organized these huge exhibitions of Yugoslav or Serbian, whatever, art. I think even the whole Vidovdan Day myth, in a way, the way it was sold to the Americans and the British, was sort of concocted there as this sort of like, this was the valiant, brave small Serbia that stood against the forces of Oriental darkness, which back then was obviously the Ottomans. Now it was the Huns, the Germans. So, and obviously there was a lot of propaganda about the mistreatment of soldiers, the women, the children. And how is that different in your view?
Well, probably in Britain, probably the most famous example that people still refer to is not in terms of First World War propaganda. It isn't so much Serbia as Belgium, and the atrocities that were. If they weren't happening, they were made up. Some atrocities were happening, some they just invented. So yes, you could say that there is a kind of humanitarian appeal there made to suffering of the other is made as an appeal to then justify military action. But I mean, you can find those continuities, but I nevertheless think that shouldn't kind of blind as to what's distinctive about the 90s. The thing about the 90s is that it's a way of kind of what they latched onto in terms of humanitarian military intervention was a way of kind of reconceptualizing and reorganizing international relations in the wake of the Cold War, and finding new enemies, new rationales for Western military action, and also kind of institutionalizing that kind of globalist order that downgraded the status of the nation, rather than as something that needed to be kind of rescued and rehabilitated, but downgraded it as something that was in the gift of the powerful. I think that is quite a distinctive and an important departure in the 1990s.
Indeed. And I think it's also, a lot of people point to, in the US, the cable television, its format, the kind of 24/7 news, and the whole technology of the media, which allowed people to jet around and pretty much live stream whatever was going on, and even make things up every once in a while. Were there many retractions during the war?
There were, and when you think about, as you said, those things like the thousands of men being held in Pristina Stadium, even just on a kind of week-by-week basis, people were kind of pointing out, well, Robin Cook, the then Foreign Secretary, said this, and then he said that, and then, there were all kinds of claims that kind of came and went. One, for example, I remember that Ibrahim Rugova had been killed, and then the next day or 2 days later he popped up on TV. Or a story that Arkan was in Kosovo, and then again another 2 days later, oh no, he's somewhere else. So there were these kind of unreliable stories that sometimes were officially endorsed or that appeared in the media and then disappeared again. In a way, it kind of didn't matter. It was a little bit like, and you can think of it the way that maybe that social media works nowadays. Things pop up in your feed. You see them. Maybe it's fact-checked by community readers, or maybe 2 days later someone calls it out as fake news. In a way, the effect of getting it there in the first place is the important thing. Those false stories just kind of feed the narrative. And even if some of them, then exposed as, in fact, being false, nevertheless, the narrative kind of trundles on.
But I mean, still, obviously, there are these sort of attempts. I mean, recently, I think it was in Syria, after the fall of Assad, when Clarissa Ward was saving that one inmate, and turned out that... I mean, that was completely made up.
That was a very striking example. I mean, I think that's a reason to be perhaps a bit more optimistic about media coverage nowadays. Is that it used to take a while. It used to take a while for these things to be exposed, and oftentimes it wouldn't really be until a war was over that you would get a proper kind of reckoning with what actually happened, and even then you might not. But that, yes, thanks to social media, that story was kind of immediately questioned. There were hundreds of people almost within hours kind of saying, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't make sense. How could this logically be true, what she's claiming? Look at
completely clean inmate of a prison that she just miraculously finds, kind of covered with a blanket. But then again, obviously propaganda needs to continue. I mean, that's and we mentioned obviously podcasts and Alistair Campbell, Rory Stewart, who are definitely not doing any sort of propaganda, and we're implying this. But I mean, how do you see the change in the propaganda model with the kind of advent of social media, and especially, I mean, instantaneous news-based social media like Twitter,
well,
X?
It's very hard to say. That's a difficult question. I think we are in a moment of flux most likely when it comes to that, because, well, there have already been many attempts, and there are ongoing attempts to find new ways to control what can be said on social media platforms. Currently, the main kind of driver of that, as far as I can see, is the EU. The British government in line with that and behind that, even though it's outside the EU. Trump's White House talks a good game when it comes to free speech, but if you look at the way that many on the American right have reacted to criticism of Israel, for example, then you have to wonder, are they really fully committed to that ideal? Probably not. So, I think it's kind of up for grabs. But there is, of course, a concerted effort to exercise more control over social media in the name of combating misinformation or disinformation. But as things stand currently, I'm nevertheless, as I said a second ago, I'm still more optimistic about the contemporary media landscape. It still looks a lot freer to me than what we had in the 90s, where it was much more difficult to access, it was possible, but it was much more difficult to access alternative sources of information and opinion.
Yeah, indeed. And I think it's also interesting that I think maybe like just before Trump's new term, so 2024, there seemed to be this real sort of, push towards having these almost supranational fact-checking organizations, which are all sort of shadily funded, sort of half government, half whichever sort of interest, which kind of would not only censor things, but also would kind of use legal means of, destroying people's lives, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, but now that seems to have subsided. Do you think that has subsided, or is it just...
Well, as far as the US is concerned, I guess that there isn't now the agenda to establish that kind of global regime of censorship. They may be unreliable allies as regards, free speech ultimately, but nevertheless, they don't have, as far as I can tell, the Trump administration doesn't have that kind of globalist style ambition to control the media.
Yeah. But do you think it has also weakened the resolve within the EU and the UK to try these?
Unfortunately not.
Oh really? Okay.
No, I think that they are still very keen to do it.
Yeah.
The way I look at it is, I may be wrong of course, but the way I look at it is that there is a kind of, ultimately the kind of dividing lines nowadays come down not so much kind of left and right, but more sort of sovereigntist versus globalist. And the EU, the kind of officialdom of the EU, is still very much wedded to that globalist outlook.
Well, it's their...
Yeah,
what
would they have?
Right?
Yes, exactly. What else have they got, right? So
they're bureaucrats. They need to increase their power.
Yes, and Britain, I think is by default still very much aligned with that. Mainly because, not because they have to be, but because they in principle, but because they are unable to articulate any kind of meaningful alternative, at least so far, and I don't see any prospect of that happening under the current Starmer government. But they've been unable to for quite a prolonged period now. Ever since the Brexit referendum, the elite in Britain have been horrified, I think, by that and the implications of that, of democratic accountability to their own electorate is much more appealing to gain their legitimacy from membership of transnational, international organisations. Yeah. And that's complicated, of course, by the fact that Britain has also historically sought to increase its status and its standing by by means of what they still fondly call the special relationship with the United States. So Britain wants to be this kind of junior partner to America, and that gives it kind of special status in international affairs, which maybe they're finding a bit more difficult nowadays under Trump.
And I mean the UK also, I mean its politics have become very, very interesting in the past few years. I mean, with sort of reform gaining a lot of ground. I think currently polling on top of, I mean, is the most popular party. Or
yes, they did. Well, they did astonishingly well in the last round of elections. They were kind of local elections, but nevertheless, it's still very, very striking how well they did. I think people, my impression is that people would like there to be an alternative, and the most kind of likely looking alternative that you could plausibly vote for at the moment is reform. Whether that's viable as a long-term project remains.
Because they're also constantly splintering and sort of.
Yes, I mean, yes, exactly, yes. So, I mean, it's not unique to Britain, of course, but I think this phenomenon of kind of new populist parties springing up and gaining a lot of ground has been a phenomenon for quite a few years now, and it speaks exactly to that desire to kind of break with that old kind of moribund two-party or uniparty system and find something new. So far, I think the results have been disappointing, but that's not to say that one should rule out the possibility of something better, a new
emerging. Yeah, and speaking of moribund systems, there's obviously like legacy media, which have also been taking a hit. I mean, ever since really the kind of social media took over, took the advertising revenue. But I mean, how do you see their future? Do you think people will still? Wow. Do you think there is a space where there's still the Guardian and the Economist?
I think,
because there has been a big erosion in
they're still going, aren't they? I mean, I think it's going to be more and more a case of kind of subsidy of one sort or another. Mm-hmm. So that might be kind of billionaire philanthropist style, subsidy. Jeff Bezos, but also Bill Gates, a big contributor to the Guardian's funding. Or it might come from government, which effectively, I mean, it all happens indirectly via a license fee, but basically the government enforces a tax that funds the BBC. And where newspapers or privately owned broadcasters can attract sufficient revenue or subscribers, they could carry on. But basically those kind of legacy media that operate on a kind of big scale, something like the BBC, it's hard to see how they would continue to do that without subsidy. If it were left to the marketplace, I'm not confident that they would be able to continue as they are. And
I mean, given that you sort of focused your research from the beginning on sort of, I mean, coverage of wars and the kind of instability basically in the world, and thankfully kind of had a very interesting decade ahead of you when you started. So you started with the Falklands War, and then obviously there was Iraq, and then Yugoslavia, and I guess Afghanistan, and all these kind of famously media botched wars. What do you think about the coverage of the wars now? I mean, it was quite exciting being on X. I mean, to be honest, the Russia-Ukraine war less so, because it was very polarized in the sense that Russia was obviously the big evil, Ukraine the greater good, or flipped in other parts of the world. But I think kind of Iran-Israel war was a very fascinating example of kind of narratives really being fractured.
Yes, that's true. I mean, it I don't know. It's very hard to judge, I find. On the one hand, you could certainly point to kind of fracturing of narratives or the kind of difficulty of imposing an official narrative. And yes, the Middle East is the kind of prime example of that, where despite a big kind of top-down effort, there's still a huge kind of popular skepticism of official claim, what is official narrative about Israel, and huge kind of sympathy for Palestinians, despite the efforts to kind of demonize them. So you could say that on the one hand. On the other hand, I was actually quite shocked with how successful the pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia narrative was in British media. It was super successful. I think a lot of people bought into that and didn't question it even for a moment. It was much more kind of powerful than I had anticipated.
But do you think again that was sort of like knocking on an open door, so to speak? I mean, because Russia is sort of always sort of an existential threat to the current UK European project.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I'm probably just very naive, because my wife said to me years ago, oh, they're so anti-Russian in Britain. I'm like, really? Are they? British people anti-Russian? And oh, yeah, okay, yes, they obviously are.
Since Crimean War.
So yes, there are those kind of long-standing, I guess you could say, kind of long-standing positions that then are kind of activated by contemporary coverage of particular events. So long-standing antipathy to Russia, long-standing sympathy indeed for the Palestinians.
Yeah.
So yes, maybe that's really what's going on. But I just to add maybe that I meant to say a second ago when you're talking about like independent media and legacy media. One of the good things I'm quite pleased about that Trump's administration has done has been to kind of undercut that. I said, you need these subsidies to survive, and by closing down USAID, they've cut a lot of that subsidising of so-called independent media, internationally, which were in fact basically dependent media, and I think that's a kind of good news story that one shouldn't discount. That's a positive development.
Yeah. Although, I mean, a lot of other countries and philanthropists stepped in to support them. So.
Yes, unfortunately, the EU are now stepping up to.
Yes, yes. But I mean, even like closing of the Voice of America.
Yeah.
And
Radio
Free Europe.
Yeah.
Which I mean, I mostly know through their disgracefully done graphs about sort of Yugoslavia, where it's always like even the kind of data has to be tilted to say Serbia bad.
Yeah.
But
yeah, so the fact that that's all just been swept away, I think, is quite a big thing. It's a positive.
Yeah. But then again, what do you think about the attempts of countries such as Qatar or Russia to kind of launch their own kind of English language or global services? I mean, like Al Jazeera, RT. Do you think that's successful in like changing the perception?
Well, that's interesting. It's hard to say. I think with Al Jazeera, it was certainly perceived as in the early 2000s. It was perceived as quite a threat to the narrative that Washington wanted to establish about Afghanistan, and then later about Iraq. So they, the fact that, I mean, the Americans even went so far as to kind of bomb Al Jazeera, Al Jazeera headquarters and journalists and they went to the Emir of Qatar and said, would you please shut this down? It's not very helpful. So the kind of free democratic country going to the, the Middle Eastern autocrat and saying, would you mind having less free media that was the scenario we saw in the early 2000s. So they were obviously worried about it and troubled by it. I guess they've kind of learned to live with it now, and maybe in some respects a lot of what Al Jazeera says in certain situations isn't that drastically different from what Western media would say. As regards Russia,
in the Balkans, there's huge complaints.
Yes, quite. Yeah, Al Jazeera, Balkans. Yeah. As regards Russia today, if you'd asked me a few years ago how much influence is it having, I would have said probably not that much. It's a kind of good thing that it's there as an alternative news channel. And you had people like, like George Galloway, for example. It gave them a kind of platform they might not otherwise have had. That was I think, a good thing. But again, the fact that the Brits and the Europeans felt moved to close it down shows that, again, they were quite worried by that they were nervous about the fact that there was an alternative, cogent narrative about the war, exposing what they were trying to push as not necessarily true. Yeah. So to that extent, I think it's important, and it's a good thing that it exists.
Yeah, and you mentioned bombing of Al Jazeera. I think also Israel also bombed their office at some point in Gaza, if I remember correctly. But obviously, we like to think of ourselves as pioneers of everything. The NATO attack on RTS, which is very close to here, where we're recording, was I guess probably not the first, but like one of the more egregious attacks. I mean, direct physical attacks on like state media. Yeah. But that seems to be the practice now. I mean, in Iran, Israel, I think both sides targeted the other's media.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting phenomenon that you can see a kind of... Certainly there's an erosion of the idea that the press are kind of a neutral actor, or at least aspiring to be some kind of neutral actor in conflict, which was always questionable, you could say, of course. But
is it Chomsky's fault that he was like, well, this is the propaganda system, so just joking? No.
Well, in a way, I think journalists do bear some of the responsibility for that, because in the 90s, again, one of the distinctive things about media coverage of Bosnia, other places too, especially Rwanda, but Bosnia primarily, was that they developed this idea that journalists should not be neutral, that it was very important that journalists take sides.
Yeah.
In fact, a British journalist, Martin Bell, was at the forefront of that idea, coined this phrase, the journalism of attachment, to describe it, saying we can't be neutral between this is a battle of good and evil, we have to be on the right side. Christiane Amanpour of CNN was saying similar things in the US. You can't be neutral, that means you're an accomplice to evil. So journalists basically said, we're not neutral, we're taking sides, we're partisan. So, they effectively then helped to make themselves targets, didn't they? And a similar experience you can find in aid agencies, aid agencies. You have to distinguish between developmental aid, which was always political, but emergency humanitarian aid was supposed to be neutral. It was supposed to give help to friend and foe alike. Even if it's the enemy that's suffering, we go and help them. And in the 90s, again, they kind of trashed that idea and started coming out and taking sides and saying we're for this side rather than that side. We're on the side of good. We're against evil. And once you do that, you kind of make yourselves a target. So it's not surprising in a way that then militaries have taken journalists at their word and treated them that way. As regards the RTS bombing, I think that's maybe slightly different. I think it did set a precedent, and the precedent that it set was that the RTS was bombed on the grounds that it was, but basically on the grounds that it was a propaganda station, that it wasn't saying the right things. And do you remember that they issued these ridiculous ultimatums? First of all, they said, unless you carry so many hours a day of Western news, then we'll bomb you. And the government here said, well, yeah, sure, we'll carry as much as you want, so long as you carry, in Western capital, you carry some of our news. And they were unnerved by that. They tried hitting transmitters first. They said, yes, we're going to bomb you. No, we're not going to bomb you. Yes, and then they did bomb them on the grounds that they were misleading people about NATO. So that, I think, is quite an important step, and I think that unnerved. Certainly, some British journalists were quite unnerved by that at the time. They saw that, if they paused to think about it, they could see that this was a very dangerous precedent to set. If one side doesn't like what the other side's media is saying, then it's fair game to bomb them. But that's at NATO's initiative, not anybody else's.
Yeah. Do you think that's going to extend maybe to independent creators? I mean, now we're all sort of
I think
media warriors.
I think it already has, yes. So, I mean, a famous example here is Kit Clarenberg, who, writes for the Grey Zone and other outlets, based in Serbia, and, was arrested by counter-terrorism police when the last time he went to Britain. Not because he'd done any terrorism or anything, but because of things that he'd written. So and he's not the only case. So there are. It's already happening in Britain, in Germany. I read recently that journalists who've written the wrong thing about Russia are getting arrested by the German authorities. So, I think we're already. Sorry to tell you, we're already in a world where independent online journalists
are fair game.
Facing similar risks.
And I mean, you can maybe say even like Daria Dugina, in a way, being assassinated in Moscow by whatever Ukrainian intelligence.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah. So cool. That's cool. Yeah. So it's a war of everybody against everybody, I guess. But I mean, do you? But I mean, how do you see this sort of shaping up? I mean, do you think there's this trend towards kind of freedom of information and I guess kind of creativity is actually going to be able to continue? Or do you think at one point they're going to figure out a way of kind of curbing social media?
They will find ways.
I mean, they, in a sense, not sort of shadowy organizations, but probably nation states or whoever leads the countries.
They, meaning, and in my mind, when I say they will find ways, I mean primarily what springs to mind is the EU. But also governments outside the EU, like probably the British government. They are looking already, and they will find ways to clamp down and try and control social media. Ultimately, I think it's difficult to have total control, and I think that for many years now they've kind of recognised. There's a kind of interesting history to this that the kind of post-Vietnam lesson that the British and American governments explicitly learned was that you have to control the media. You can't trust the media. You have to control and limit what they can have access to and what they can see. And you have to, if necessary, vet their copy, censor them, and so on. And they applied that lesson for many decades. It wasn't really until the first kind of obvious example where it didn't wash was in the second Iraq war in 2003, where they explicitly then announced a kind of different policy and said, okay, we can't control the media landscape completely. What we need to do instead is to just pump out our narrative, pump out our information.
Flooding the zone.
Flood the zone with as much of that desirable content for us, in the hope that will then squeeze out space for alternative, as they would say, false narratives or critical perspectives. And I think that's probably that plus concerted efforts at narrative control. I think that's probably still more or less the kind of strategy. I don't think you can, yes, of course, there is this ambition to clamp down and shut up sources of information that are persistently annoying on grounds of disinformation or something like that. But you're never going to completely, I don't think you're ever going to be completely able to control the media in the way that it might have been possible, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah. No, very, very exciting times. And I mean, if you were to start again now as a sort of student in media, what would be your sort of main research focus?
Ooh.
Or what is your current research focus?
That's a very interesting question. Because when I did start, my main concern was what's the relationship between broadcasting as broadcast news being the most popular, most influential source of information, the relationship between broadcast news and the state. And the reason for being interested in that was to say what are the limits on media freedom. I think that would still be the question. That's still the question now. Just that you wouldn't necessarily be looking only at the states and governments. You'd also be looking at private corporations, and you'd be looking at transnational institutions like the EU or NATO, and seeing how they influence and control media freedom.
Yeah. Do you think the coverage of whatever the Yugoslav wars would have been different had we had TikTok?
That's
and live streaming.
Well, that's an interesting counterfactual. People. What that puts me in mind of is the argument that you sometimes hear that. The problem that the Yugoslav side had in the early 90s was that they didn't have a slick PR operation, unlike the Croats, and the Muslims had a much better kind of sense of PR. I'm not convinced that a good PR operation itself is decisive. I think, as I said earlier, there was already a kind of predisposition to understand events in a certain way. Yeah. Now, how far you could counteract that predisposition by kind of grassroots social media, for example, via TikTok, I personally am a bit skeptical. Look at Russia, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war. I don't know that Russian social media users have been massively influential in changing the way that the West views the war. The way the West views the war is, as we said earlier,
or I guess vice versa.
Yes. It is based on quite long-standing ideas, then kind of brought into focus by particular propaganda strategies focused around contemporary events. Shifting that is quite a big task. But nevertheless, one of the good things about things like platforms like TikTok is that at least they do provide a space for that. They do provide new possibilities for that. So maybe it would have all looked different if we
maybe. Maybe. Well, cool. Thanks a lot. Anything else you would like to maybe add?
No.
And how was working with Harold Pinter, by the way?
Oh, well, that again was slightly accidental because I went to there was an organisation that had first sprung up at the time of the first Gulf War, called Journalists Against War, in 1991. And I went along to their meetings in London. And
what was it, like Chefs Against Restaurants? I mean,
they exactly. They then kind of reconstituted themselves. Had some more meetings in 1999, and Harold Pinter came along to. John Pilger came along to one. I think Harold Pinter put in an appearance, or he wrote things in the media, critical of the war. So it put me in mind of maybe just asking him. So we cheekily asked him would he write a foreword, and he did. No. And then he even came to the book launch.
Incredible.
Yeah,
Cool.
I was very pleased.
Nice. Well, thanks a lot.